and I want to ask you about the Millennium Development Goals. I interviewed one of your deputies at the United Nations, Mark Mallet-Brown, and he spoke about how important the optimistic mood around 2000 and the introduction of the MDGs was. It was after the Berlin Wall, it was pre-Iraq, it was pre-9/11, pre-Syria, pre the financial crisis. Now the question is whether you feel that the lack of optimism, if you like, the fundamental focus on security issues might undermine the SDGs as they come into force, or indeed fundamentally just eclipse them.
It's a very good question. We were lucky at the time of the MDGs. There was optimism. It was a 10 of the millennium. And we use the accident of calendar very effectively to motivate and get people to do things. Today the mood is a bit sour. We have a difficult economic environment. Growth is not what it should be. We have conflicts around us, from Middle East to Africa to Asia and Afghanistan. So when people feel prosperous and economically stable, they are much more generous and open and receptive to new ideas, and particular ideas that comes with that requires them to give, that asks them to do something. When the times are hard and they are focused on themselves or their communities, it's much more difficult. And of course, as you also point out, this whole security issue and suspicion of the other makes it difficult for people to relax and reach out. But this is where it becomes important that in this new Sustainable Development Goals, it's not just the governments, it's not just the countries of the South, but it's a global demand. We hope the private sector will play a role. We hope the governments themselves will go back home and begin to implement it. The Sustainable Development Goals are much more complicated, much more complex.
There's more of them.
More of them, actually, than the Millennium Development Goals, which were straightforward and simple, and we designed it that way. We put it in a simple language that a man or woman in the street in Delhi or Bogota or Accra will understand. And demand that their leaders implement it.
Bringing it back to the people.
People, getting the UN back to the people and getting them involved. And we have had some successes. I mean, the absolute poverty has been halved. And in fact, we did it 5 years ahead of scale. But it is going to be much tougher with the SDGs. But having embraced it, I hope they'll go out and fight for it.
Halving poverty was a success, largely because of Asia. I could ask you about Africa, which is a bit more patchy. But what I do want to ask you about is the 8th Millennium Development Goal, which is a partnership for development, which is ostensibly about getting the rich to help the poor. And there were problems with that. And I'm just wondering if you've got views on what needs to happen in the SDGs to surmount those issues.
Yeah, I think there were problems with that. Lots of promises were made. As I've kept telling them, only promises which are kept are promises which matter. You don't bring people around year after year and make more promises that you don't keep. And I think the mentality, there's been a mental shift. The developing countries realize they cannot develop their countries with development aid. They have to rely on their own resources and their own abilities. And they have also opened up to private sector and private investment, which some were not at all receptive to in the past. And so there's a new dynamics. For example, we were talking yesterday, the question of transparency came up. I was in London talking to the British Prime Minister and ministers when they were chairing the G7 about the need to work together to ensure transparency, to try and stop the illicit flows coming out of Africa. Not only were they not paying taxes, but the governments were not seeing any of the investments that they thought was going to give them returns. By coincidence, this was also an issue on their agenda when they discovered that some of the big companies were not paying taxes and they were shifting headquarters around to avoid paying taxes. So there was a coincidence of interest. And we decided to work together, and I saw in the Financial Times today that they've come up with a proposal on how to tackle these illicit flows
Yeah.
and
the OECD is pushing this very hard through BEPS, etc., and you would welcome that. You think the tax havens issue is a major problem.
And I had been with them. They even talked about preparing a cadre that will go out and help. What were they calling them? Inspectors Without Borders.
Right.
To go and do this. So I'm very happy to see that development. And I think what is important is both sides have a role to play.
Yes.
I would want to see a situation where the companies would publish their figures, that we came into country A and we paid X amount to the government, and the government confirms it and tells us people what it's doing with the money.
Yes, transparency is a great astringent, isn't it?
It's a powerful tool.